Talked about the binding of Satan in the Gospels. This is the binding of Satan in Revelation. In the first message, we saw that the binding of Satan in the Gospels and the binding of Satan in Revelation are two different versions of the same event. Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us the literal historical version, while John gives us the apocalyptic version filled with vivid and dramatic imagery. In the Gospels, Yeshua pursues Satan into the wilderness, engages him, and defeats him. This results in Satan being bound and dethroned from his heavenly position. In John's apocalyptic version, this is depicted as an angel coming down from heaven, having a key and a great chain. The angel seizes Satan, binds him, and throws him into the abyss, which is shut and sealed over him. As David Chilton says, the angel is the Lord Jesus Christ, whose absolute control and authority are symbolized by the key and the great chain. So, the angel symbolizes Christ, while the key and the great chain symbolize his strength and authority. But what about the abyss? What does that symbolize, and what message is John conveying through this image? This is really the key question, since it's precisely because of this abyss imagery that many contend that Satan's binding in Revelation and Satan's binding in the Gospels are not the same event. They point out that throughout the entirety of the New Testament, Satan is very much active in the world and busy on the earth. And indeed, even after Yeshua himself says he's bound the strongman, Satan enters Judas and sifts Peter like wheat. He takes away the word that's been sown in a person's heart and fills Ananias' heart to lie to the Holy Spirit. He still has a kingdom, and people can be delivered over to him. He schemes, outwits, and appears as an angel of light. And even believers need to be on their guard against those schemes. He hinders Paul and Timothy and holds people captive. He prowls about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So, even after Yeshua himself, or even after Yeshua bound him, Satan is still active in tempting people, persecuting believers, and blinding the eyes of unbelievers. How then can Satan be bound in the abyss if he's still causing so much havoc on the earth? In answering this question, it's important to remember that Satan is in the abyss in John's vision. That does not at all mean that he's literally in the abyss in reality. When a prophet or a seer had a dream or a vision, the images they were seeing with their eyes are not the same as the realities those images represented. We tend to think that they were seeing the actual events themselves, playing out like divine news footage on a heavenly TV screen. But that's not at all how it worked. They were not seeing the events themselves. If we go with the TV screen analogy, picture a disclaimer that would say something like this: the following is a prophetic vision that contains images and symbols representing real-world events, but are not the actual events themselves. That was my TV announcer voice. Anyway, so in other words, the angel binding the dragon and throwing him into the abyss are not real events. They are symbolic representations of real events. Like the prophets who went before him, John seeing images that represent the events he's prophesying about, but not the actual events themselves. And mixing and matching the images from the vision with the realities they represent would produce some pretty bizarre interpretations. Yet, that's exactly what we do when we ask, how can Satan be bound in the abyss and active on the earth at the same time? In no other portion of the prophecy would we mix the image with the reality and ask a question like this. Throughout the prophecy, there's a clear distinction between the images that John sees in the vision and the realities that those images represent. In Revelation 1:12, for example, John turns and sees 7 golden lampstands. In verse 20, he's told these 7 golden lampstands aren't really lampstands at all. They are, in reality, the 7 churches. But what does John actually see in the vision? 7 golden lampstands. What are they in reality? The 7 churches. Lampstand is the symbol. Church is the referent. But a congregation of people is not literally a lampstand. The imagery makes sense because God's people are to be a light to the world, but it's still an image, quite different from the reality it represents. In John 5:5, or in Revelation 5:5, John is told, look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered. And he turns and sees a what? He sees a lamb standing as if it had been slain. So, what does John actually see with his eyes? He sees a lamb. That's the imagery. That's the symbol. What does the lamb represent? It represents Yeshua. But Yeshua is not literally a lamb or a lion. And no one would ask, how can a lion be a lamb and how can a person be either? No, we understand these are images within the vision that represent Christ. Nevertheless, what John actually sees with his eyes is the image or the symbol and not Yeshua himself. And this lamb that John sees has 7 horns and 7 eyes. And what do these 7 horns and 7 eyes represent? The verse tells us they are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. But again, what does John actually see? He sees 7 horns and 7 eyes. What are they in reality? The 7 spirits of God. Again, there's a clear distinction between the symbol and the referent, between the image and the reality. John does not actually see the 7 spirits of God going out into all the earth. Next, John sees golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So again, what does he see? Golden bowls full of incense. What are they in reality? The prayers of the saints. John sees neither the saints praying nor the actual prayers rising to God. He sees images that represent these realities. A great example is the beast imagery of Revelation 13. What does John actually see in the vision? He sees a 7-headed beast coming out of the sea. And as Vern Poitras points out, preterists usually think the beast refers to the Roman Empire or Roman emperor. Futurists think it refers to the final Antichrist, who may be associated with a revived Roman Empire, and Protestant historicists find a reference to the papacy. His point here is that everyone, even futurists, recognize that what John sees in the vision is not the actual historical figure that the beast image represents. If you're a preterist, John didn't see Nero coming out of the water. If you're a futurist, John didn't see Joe Biden or whomever the Antichrist is this week coming out of the water. And if you're a historicist, John didn't even see the Pope coming out of the water. So what does John actually see? A seven-headed beast. What is it in reality? Either Nero Caesar, Joe Biden, or the Pope, depending on your eschatology. The point is that what he actually saw was an image that represents a reality no matter how you interpret that reality. Probably my favorite example is the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21. The New Jerusalem is a golden cube measuring 1,500 miles on all sides. Now, 1,500 square miles is the approximate size of the Roman Empire in the first century. In other words, it's a city as large as the known world of the time. Its cubical shape matches the shape of the Holy of Holies in the temple and tabernacle. Excuse me. The Holy of Holies, of course, was where the manifest presence of Yahweh resided, and it was overlaid with pure gold. As golden cubes, writes Desmond Alexander, the Holy of Holies and the New Jerusalem are clearly connected. G.K. Beale captures the significance of the imagery here. God's tabernacling presence, once limited to the Holy of Holies, is to be extended throughout the whole earth. In other words, and David just talked about this, sacred space is now anywhere on the face of the planet that a true believer is. That's what the imagery is conveying. But what does John actually see in the vision? He sees a golden, cube-shaped city as large as the known world. What does it represent in reality? It represents God's manifest presence in and among His people throughout the entire world. The symbol is a beautiful representation of the reality, but it is nevertheless still a symbol. It's an image and a vision that's not meant to be taken literally as if we're actually inside the walls of a golden city. And mixing the image with the reality in a literal manner is just not a legitimate form of biblical interpretation. Churches are not literally lampstands. Yeshua is not literally a lamp. The seven spirits of God are not literally seven horns or seven eyes. Our prayers are not literally golden bowls of incense. Nero was not literally a seven-headed beast, and we are not literally inside the walls of a golden city. So I hope you can see that what John sees in his visions are images and symbols that represent these events and realities. He does not actually see the events or realities themselves. While the symbol is meant to say something about the referent, the symbol is not literally the referent or vice versa. And mixing the symbol with the referent or the image with the reality would lead to absurdity, and I think everyone recognizes this. So why then do we insist on mixing the image with the reality when it comes to the binding of Satan in Revelation 20? Why do we assume he's literally in the abyss? Satan was not literally in the abyss any more than we are literally inside the walls of a golden city shaped like a cube. Just like every other image or picture in Revelation, the abyss is a symbol meant to communicate something about the actual reality it symbolizes. And the abyss, specifically, is meant to communicate something about Satan's binding. But we can't know what John is trying to communicate through the use of the abyss imagery if we don't know what the abyss is in the first place. And therein lies the problem when it comes to this passage. What is the abyss. Having said that, John sees no need to define the term or explain it. It's simply taken as a given. It's rather obvious then that John expects his readers to be familiar with the term abyss, and indeed they would have been. And given that fact, it's equally obvious that if we want to know what John was attempting to telegraph to his readers with the usage of this image, then we need to read what they read and understand how the term was used in the literature of their time. In other words, we need to bridge the gap, the distance in time between the ancient world of the text and our world today. And in this case, that bridge is the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures that the first century Christians in Asia Minor would have used. And the word abyss is used extensively throughout its pages. Now, having said that, it's commonly assumed that abyss refers to the underworld, and Satan's confinement there would completely remove him from the earth. For example, Matthew Waymeyer writes, the location of the devil's imprisonment makes it especially clear that the confinement of Revelation 20, 1 through 3, would prevent any satanic activity and influence on the earth during the 1,000 years. The abyss entails the complete removal of activity and influence upon the earth. Another writer says, in Revelation 20, 1 through 3, John sees Satan captured and banished from the earth to the prison of the abyss. He speaks of the capture, chaining, and imprisonment of Satan in the underworld abyss and refers to Satan's underworld prison, which is locked and sealed over him. This idea, popular as it may be, does not come from the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, the word is never used to translate the term Sheol, something that me and Jeff and David have been talking about a little bit. But anyhow, abyss is never used to translate that term, that the Hebrew word for the underworld. According to Beale and McDonough, the abyss in the Septuagint is always related to water, whether it be the chaotic waters, the primeval deep of the creation account, the waters of the sea, or the waters below the earth. Additionally, as Edward Goodman points out, the abyss is also understood to supply the water contained in the seas, the lakes, and the rivers. In other words, it is the source of all landlocked bodies of water as well. We see this in Genesis 49:25, where a well-watered land is referred to as the blessings of the abyss that lies beneath. And in Exodus 15:5, where Pharaoh and his armies drown in the Red Sea and the abyss covers them. Likewise, the psalmist says God rebuked the Red Sea and led his people through the abyss. In the desert, he splits the rock and gives them water to drink abundantly as from the abyss. And he brings them into a good land, a land of brooks and waters, of fountains and springs flowing out into the valleys and hills. The word translated springs is abyss. It's quite literally the fountains of the abyss that flow out into the hills and valleys. So that's how the word is used in the Septuagint, and the New Testament follows suit. Outside of John's usage in Revelation, abyss appears only 2 other times, and its meaning is clear in both contexts. The first is Yeshua's encounter with the legion of demons in Luke 8, who beg him not to send them into the abyss. As Luke explains later, when an unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places seeking rest. This goes back to what we talked about in the first message regarding the desert or the wilderness being the habitat of demons and evil spirits. For whatever reason, they preferred the dry wilderness when they were not in possession of a human host. So, what does Yeshua do? He permits them to go into a herd of swine. And where do the swine take the demons? In almost humorous irony, they take them straight into a lake. As Sarah Fisher says, by their own doing, they fell into the abyss. The very place they begged Yeshua not to send them. Or, as Todd Klutz puts it, the demons' fear of being sent to the abyss is realized by their ultimate transferal to the watery grave. To miss the connection here between the abyss and the lake is to completely miss the irony and satire of the passage. Yeshua is not having mercy on them. He's sending them to where they didn't want to go. The other occurrence of the word outside of Revelation is Paul's statement in Romans 10, where he says, "But the righteousness of faith speaks as follows. Do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is, to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is, to bring Christ up from the dead." Now, Paul's quoting Deuteronomy 30 here, which says, "For this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you, neither is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us to bring it to us that we may hear it and do it." Paul's clearly substituting the abyss for the sea in this passage and equating the two terms. He's also tracking on the idea that the abyss or the sea was considered to be an abode of the dead, as John does in Revelation 20 when he says, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it." But our main point here is that Deuteronomy says sea and Paul says abyss. Thus, these are two different terms having the same meaning. The words are interchangeable, and you can swap one out for the other, as John himself does in Revelation. For example, in Revelation 11:7 and 17:8, the beast arises from the abyss. But in Revelation 13:1, the beast arises from the sea. Simply put, the abyss and the sea are synonymous for John, as most commentators recognize. For example, Adela Collins, "The abyss and the sea are equivalent for all intents and purposes." Likewise, Richard Bockham, "The abyss and the sea are identical," and Jonathan Moo. Since the sea and the abyss are both described as the origin of the beast, the two terms are linked and both refer to the same thing, namely the primeval sea to which all other seas are linked. The correlation between the abyss and water is especially clear in Revelation 9, when John speaks of the well of the abyss. A well, of course, is an excavated structure meant to access an underground source of water. Now, some translations will use the word shaft here instead of well, but a shaft could refer to any artificial hole in the ground, like a mine shaft, for instance. That's really not specific enough to convey the word's most accurate meaning. This is the same word that's used in Luke 14 when Jesus speaks of someone's ox falling into a well on the Sabbath day, and in John 4 and the story of the woman at the well. The word specifically refers to an artificial tank or an artificial well, a tank, a cistern, or reservoir. As Sean McDonough notes, the word is typically used of wells rather than merely shafts, so shaft probably isn't the best translation here. And the bottom line is simply that the idea that there would be a well leading to the abyss reinforces the fact that the abyss is always related to water. So the usage of the word is consistent throughout the Septuagint and the New Testament. And this includes John's own usage of the term in the book of Revelation. Having said that, those who want to make abyss equal the underworld will argue as follows. During the intertestamental period, the meaning of abyss was broadened to include the underworld, and a complete changeover took place in the New Testament to the point that this was all the word meant, namely the underworld. As we'll see in a minute, the idea of the abyss would have always included the underworld, but it was never limited to the underworld. But, even more importantly, if John wanted to convey the idea that Satan was trapped in the underworld, there's a perfectly good word he could have used, and in fact does use elsewhere in Revelation, and that would be the word Hades. This is the same word that the Septuagint uses 66 times to translate the Hebrew word for the underworld, Sheol. He doesn't use this word to describe the area Satan's confined to. He uses abyss, a word that refers to, again, that body of water that was thought to surround the earth, run underneath it, and was the source of all landlocked bodies of water as well, such as rivers, lakes, and streams. Now, does this mean that Jesus literally threw Satan into the ocean? No. Remember, like everything else in Revelation, this is an image in the vision that's meant to communicate something about the reality it represents. So, what could John possibly be trying to convey through the use of this image? Satan's trapped in the abyss. What would this mean to John's original audience? To answer this question, it will be helpful to acquaint ourselves with the three-tiered cosmology of the ancient world and to keep John Calvin's words in mind as we do. The detailed pictures in Scripture, says Calvin, are images adapted to our capacities of understanding. I would simply qualify this by saying they are images adapted to the original audience's capacities of understanding. Today, we don't look at the world this way anymore, and as Alan Paget says, this world picture is so different from our own that it takes a sustained act of sympathetic imagination to place ourselves back into the cosmology of the ancient world, a picture of the universe that C.S. Lewis once called the discarded image. That being said, if we do discard this image and assign a meaning to the abyss that was never intended by the authors of Scripture, our interpretation of Satan's binding in the abyss will never match what John was trying to convey to his readers. So we're not going to discard that image. We're going to allow it to help us understand what John is saying in this passage. As you can see, you have heaven above, the earth in the middle, and below that is everything under the earth, which would include, but wasn't limited to, Sheol or the underworld. And within this discarded image, this three-tiered cosmological model, notice the placement of the abyss. It is, again, that body of water that was thought to encircle the earth, intersect it, and run underneath it, But even more importantly, the abyss connects the two lower tiers, the earth and the underworld, but is completely disconnected from the upper tier or heaven. As Brian Godawa says, the abyss was the transition between this world and the underworld. Therefore, says G.K. Beale, it is a fallacy to suggest that in Revelation 21 through 3, the abyss is spatially removed from the earth, inhibiting direct contact with the earth. Indeed, the abyss is not spatially removed from the earth, it's spatially removed from heaven. Thus, the imagery of Satan being bound in the abyss then would have meant that he was trapped between the earth and the underworld, the area which the abyss encompassed, and the area from which he no longer had access to heaven. So, continued activity on the earth and in the underworld was to be expected, but he couldn't marshal and control his forces like he once did from a position of authority in heaven. When you're not all-knowing and all-powerful, which Satan was not, you need a hierarchy, a structure, a chain of command. And Yeshua disrupted that hierarchy, dismantled that structure, and severed that chain of command. Again, this does not at all mean that Yeshua literally threw Satan into the ocean. Satan is in the abyss in the vision. John's using the image to convey the idea that Satan was confined to this realm, having lost his heavenly position of authority. So, what does John see in the vision? He sees Satan trapped in the abyss. That's the imagery. What does it represent in reality? It represents Satan's access to heaven being cut off. Why? Because Yeshua stripped him of that position. And isn't this exactly what he tells the 72 in Luke 10? As a result of his victory in the wilderness, Satan had fallen from heaven like lightning, and the demons saw their leader dethroned and defeated. John and Luke are both saying the same thing, only in a different way. In Luke, Yeshua attacks and overpowers Satan, takes away his armor, and plunders his house. The word for attack means to come upon suddenly or forcibly in a hostile sense, to invade. In Revelation, Yeshua seizes Satan and throws him into the abyss. The word for seize means to be strong or superior, to subdue, to vanquish. It's two different versions of the same thing. Namely, Yeshua conquered his enemy with overwhelming force and stripped him of his heavenly position. Next, John says that the abyss was shut and sealed over Satan. His audience would have been very familiar with this terminology. It's taken from a Second Temple text, the prayer of Manasseh, which speaks of God restraining the forces of chaos at the time of the original creation. It reads, O Lord, Almighty God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of their righteous seed, who has made heaven and earth and all the ornament thereof. And catch this, who has bound the sea by the word of thy commandment, who has shut up the abyss and sealed it by thy terrible and glorious name, whom all men fear. In their commentary on the prayer of Manasseh, Vanderhurst and Newman point out that these words in the opening of the prayer stretch all the way back to the creation account and are meant to recall God's control over the forces of chaos when he spoke order into existence. The similarity between the prayer and John's words in Revelation 20 is unmistakable. Both speak of the abyss, and both employ the same threefold sequence of binding, shutting, and sealing using the exact same Greek words. The prayer of Manasseh, writes G.K. Beale, speaks of God restraining the evil chaos powers at the beginning of creation with wording strikingly similar to Revelation 20, 2 through 3. David also makes this connection and suggests that John is using traditional and well-known terminology relating to the original time of creation and repurposing it in an eschatological sense. And this fits the context. What's coming next in the book of Revelation? What comes in chapters 21 to 22? The new heavens and the new earth, the new Jerusalem, which is that golden city that we talked about earlier. So, what does John see in the vision? He sees the abyss being shut and sealed over Satan. That's the imagery. What does it mean in reality? It means God's restraining the forces of chaos in order to bring about the new creation. And the prayer of Manasseh is the key that allows us to unlock the mystery of the imagery and understand exactly what John's trying to communicate through these symbols. By drawing on this earlier Jewish prayer, the message John's telegraphing to his readers is that God is restraining the leader of the forces of chaos, Satan, and giving his servants time to bring order back to the cosmos through the preaching of the gospel to all nations. Satan is not allowed to initiate the war until this happens. And this brings us to a very important point. The reason for Satan's binding. Why precisely was he bound? It was not to prevent him from generally engaging in any of the activities that the New Testament writers say he was engaged in after Yeshua bound him in the wilderness. The reason for his binding was very, very specific. He was bound so that he wouldn't deceive the nations any longer, and this deception is specifically tied to the war of verse 10. As Michael Heiser says, the Greek lemma translated deceive here is planeo. BDAG, which is the standard Greek lexicon for New Testament literature, has the lemma's primary meaning as leading astray in a specific way. The specifics, says Heiser, are best defined in terms of what Satan does when he's permitted to do what he does, and the text is clear on that point. Do you know what he does? Asks Heiser. He leads the nations against Zion. So, if that's what he does when he's permitted, then that's what he was prevented from doing in the first place. We let one passage interpret the other. Amen, Dr. Heiser. And while I agree with everything Heiser says here, you are always amazed that the man's a futurist. Because the very fact that Satan is eventually permitted to do what he was prevented from doing in the first place leaves futurists absolutely baffled. For them, Satan's release and that final war with Yahweh is still future, and they don't know what to make of it. For example, Tonstad writes, but the second part of the action obliterates the impact of the first. Satan is bound and, heaven forbid, released. Even if we allow for symbolic language and hyperbole, he says, this is enough to make the reader choke. Other writers concur. But why is Satan merely bound, and why is he ever to be loosed again? Why must he be let loose to wreak further havoc? Sweet asks, why could he not have been liquidated from the beginning? Just why this is done, says Metzger, is an undisclosed mystery. Very simply, Talbert asks, what's the point? You see, they just can't make sense of how this whole thing wraps up. Why is Satan released? Well, to escape this predicament, and the way they do this makes about as much sense as the way they explain the no exorcism in John's gospel. They say that there must be a mistake in the text or a lapse in concentration of the author. Charles claimed that the original composer must have died an untimely death, and his unfinished composition was taken over by an unintelligent disciple. Lohmeyer argued that at this point, the author just got tired and failed to perform at his best. Croft took the view that John wasn't so much tired at this point, but he just lost interest and rushed through an ending that turned out to be a bad ending. So it's pretty clear. Futurists have no good answer as to why Satan is ever released, and even Ken Gentry is at a loss to explain it. He says, why will Satan be loosed? I continue to receive this question on a regular basis. You will have to ask John, not me, for he does not say. Well, actually, he does say. He says Satan must be released for a short time to deceive the nations, to gather them together for the war. If this war is in fact the Roman-Jewish war of AD 66 to 70, then everything makes sense. It had to take place out of necessity. What was the end result of this war? The end result was the destruction of the temple. That was absolutely necessary for two reasons. First, Jesus predicted it would happen in that generation. If 40 years go by and that temple is still standing, he's a failed and false prophet. He said not one stone would be left upon another, so that temple had to come down. Second, as long as it still stood, it was still possible to keep the Old Covenant with all its rituals and sacrifices, the 613 laws that David talked about earlier. Hebrews 8 tells us that although Yeshua had inaugurated the new covenant, the Old Covenant had not completely vanished yet, and it wouldn't completely vanish until the temple vanished, and that wouldn't happen until the Romans destroyed it. So, everything fits and everything makes sense when we understand the millennium as the 40-year period that began with Yeshua's binding of the strongman and culminated in the outbreak of the Roman-Jewish war, leading to the temple's destruction. And regarding the binding of Satan, John gives us the apocalyptic version of the event filled with symbols and vivid imagery, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us the straightforward historical narrative. Like everything else in Revelation, the abyss functions as an image in the vision. The abyss was viewed as the waters that connected the two lower tiers of the cosmos, but was disconnected from heaven. Thus, Satan's confinement in the abyss represented his loss of heavenly authority. John's language of binding, shutting, and sealing the abyss echoes the prayer of Manasseh and the idea of restraining the forces of chaos to bring about the new creation. Once the gospel had sufficiently gone out into the entire Roman Empire and people from all known nations were made members of Yahweh's family again, Satan is briefly released to ensure the destruction of earthly Jerusalem. And now all that's left is the true tabernacle, the heavenly Jerusalem. And Satan would have had no idea and no way of knowing that this was God's plan all along. He picks the wrong target. earthly Jerusalem, while God's true people, Jews and Gentiles alike, are now members of the heavenly Jerusalem. The old Jerusalem is destroyed, the new Jerusalem is rescued, and God disposes of Satan once and for all after he's accomplished his purposes. And now we live in the realities that the images of Revelation 21 through 22 represent. And, our job today is to make sure those realities are in fact realities and not just words on a page in a book. But God's people will never start doing that as long as we're stuck in the past. And that's why, I think a proper approach to Revelation 20 is just so important. We need to put the past behind us, start living in the present, and focus on the future and assume our role as His image bearers in the new creation. And David, how am I on time? Because, okay, yeah, if anyone has any questions, I don't want to cut into Dr. Grant's time. Yeah.
The imagery of the 1,000 years, what is that for the reality of that? The 1,000 years is 40 years?
I think it's just simply hyperbole. I had a message on that. If you go on the Berean site, the Bible uses hyperbolic numbers all the time. The one that comes to my mind right away is, Saul has killed his thousands and David killed his tens of thousands. But this is actually, so I think it's hyperbole, but what I think is going on since David, never mind, it's too complicated. But it's hyperbole, yeah. Well, okay, real quick, long story short. Okay, if you go to my second Exodus message, I'm trying to tie the 1,000 years, the millennium in with the second Exodus. And if you go to the book of Jubilees, it talks about Mastema being bound for 5 days before the original Exodus. So the imagery of an evil being, and Mastema is another name for Satan. So that kind of works in with the Exodus idea. And so basically what you walk away with is a 5-day binding equals the exodus of a nation, okay? Well, the new Exodus isn't about Israel, it's about all the other nations. And David talked about, in the Septuagint, the table of nations in Genesis 10, in the Septuagint, you have 72 nations. Well, 5 times 72, I think I'm doing the math right, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but 5 times 72 equals 360, which is a solar year. John followed the solar calendar in the book of Revelation. Most scholars agree, 360 days. So that's an entire year. You go to people like G.K. Beale, they say the 1,000 simply means fullness, completeness, totality. So it is that exodus of all those nations just multiplied that much to show fullness, completeness, and totality. I don't know if you followed that, but whatever. I told you didn't want to hear it. Yeah.
I brought this scripture up yesterday, I think, at the end of your talk about the prince and the power of the air.
Yeah.
Ephesians 2, I think it was 2.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I went into the Greek, and the word is air, which means denser air, not atmospheric air, it's denser air.
Oh, yeah.
And so it says like the lower...
Yeah, so that would have been the lower region.
And then I also went to 2 Corinthians 4:4, where it talks about the God of this world.
Yeah.
Who used to follow that. And it was interesting because as I looked at the Greek on that, it says the age, aeon is what it is. Aeon.
Oh, wow.
And it referenced in this Strong's Concordance the Jewish age.
Yeah.
So he was the God of the Jewish age.
Yeah.
Way of translating.
Actually, I didn't realize that cosmos wasn't used there. That's interesting, yeah. Oh, wow.
And then,
Whoa.
and age.
Yeah. Oh, good stuff.
Do you have any thoughts how that might fit in, like the denser air into that?
Oh, well, yeah.
That's all right. Maybe it's not a problem.
The higher region is Oranos. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. And yeah, the lower region would be Ere. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that one right either. I have a hard enough time with English. let alone Greek and Hebrew. So if I'm butchering these words, whatever. But the funny thing is, I always think, like everyone's like, oh, this is how you pronounce it or whatever. Okay, like were any of you living like 2,000 years ago to hear the language spoken? Like, how do we actually know that? I don't know. But yeah, which it is. Yeah, it's the it would be the lower, denser region. Yeah, and I didn't even realize that was the word that was used there, or that it was age instead of cosmos. So, really interesting. Yeah.
You may have touched on this yesterday, so forgive me if I'm forgetting, but when Yeshua says, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning, is this what it's in reference to? Like his heavenly powers off or cut off, he's cut off from there and down?
I believe that's what it's in reference to, and I cited an article by Julian Hills where, I mean, if you want to drill down on the Greek grammar, it's pretty technical, but I think Hills makes his point that I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning probably isn't the best translation. They saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. So it would have been the demons that saw him fall from heaven like lightning. And I think it makes better sense of the context, because then, they're like, Lord, even the demons obey us. And he's saying, yeah, you bet they do. They saw me clean Satan's clock, and they know they're no match for you. So I like it, and it does fit the context. Jeff?
I get the 40-year bookends of Satan, and I agree with it completely. I read another book that goes in that very detail, but what was the final disposition of Satan after 66, after 70?
Oh, I think he's in the lake of fire, which I believe, well, I think Jeff would probably agree with me. It's a real place. He's suffering eternal torment. But then David thinks, like David makes a good point too, fire just burns stuff up. So he was either annihilated or he's suffering in hell. I mean,
Does fire burn up a spiritual being?
I have no idea. yeah. That's why I'm saying what David said. Yeah, but what David said makes sense. But then go back to what I was talking about. All this stuff is images in the vision. Like, none of it is the actual events. So, yeah. But I mean, either way, and I really don't know. That's one of those things that I'm like, when we get to heaven, we'll know exactly what happened. But either way, he's gone. He's history. He's toast. He's, either annihilated or in, the lake of fire.